The catalyst for change. On a bright, sunny afternoon in the bustling streets of a diverse metropolitan city, Naomi Carter, an accomplished FBI agent, stepped out of her favorite coffee shop. She was on a much-needed break, her mind momentarily free from the heavy weight of her cases. Dressed casually in jeans, sneakers, and a light jacket, Naomi blended effortlessly with the eclectic crowd of the downtown area. She held her warm cup of coffee, savoring the rare moment of peace. Across the street, Officer Greg Stanton, a patrol cop known for his rigid approach to law enforcement, was scanning the area. His eyes locked onto Naomi, and his years of prejudice quickly filled the gaps in his assumptions. She didn't fit the profile of someone he expected to see in this upscale neighborhood. Without hesitation, he crossed the street, his demeanor stern and authoritative. "Excuse me, ma'am," Stanton called out, stepping into Naomi's path. Naomi stopped mid-sip, her eyes meeting his with a calm, curious gaze. "Yes, officer. How can I help you?" "May I see some ID?" Stanton's voice was clipped, his tone carrying an edge of suspicion. Naomi tilted her head slightly, surprised by the abruptness of the request. "ID? May I ask why?" Her voice was calm but firm, a testament to her experience dealing with challenging situations. "You're acting suspicious," Stanton replied, his voice raised just enough to catch the attention of nearby pedestrians. "This isn't exactly a neighborhood you'd just wander into without a reason." Naomi raised an eyebrow, her composure unwavering. "Suspicious. I'm walking with a cup of coffee. Is there something specific you're accusing me of?" Stanton's posture grew more intimidating. "Just show me your ID, ma'am. Don't make this difficult." A small crowd began to gather, drawn by Stanton's raised voice and assertive stance. Naomi sighed, reaching for her wallet. She handed over her ID without protest, but maintained eye contact with the officer. Stanton examined the ID briefly before looking back at her, unimpressed. "What are you doing in this area? You don't look like you belong here." Naomi took a slow breath, her patience wearing thin. "Officer," she began, her tone sharp but polite, "I've complied with your request. Now I'd like to know what grounds you have for stopping me." The crowd around them started murmuring, and a few bystanders discreetly pulled out their phones to record the unfolding scene. Stanton ignored the growing attention, his frustration evident. "Don't get smart with me," he snapped. "We can do this the easy way, or we can do it the hard way." Naomi squared her shoulders, her calm demeanor intact. "I'm not making this difficult, Officer Stanton. But I suggest you look at my ID again, closely this time." Stanton hesitated, glancing at the ID once more. His face betrayed a flicker of uncertainty before returning to his defiant stance. Naomi could sense he still didn't realize who he was dealing with. She decided it was time to end the charade. With deliberate calm, Naomi reached into her jacket pocket and pulled out her badge. The gleaming FBI emblem caught the sunlight, eliciting audible gasps from the crowd. Holding it up for all to see, she spoke clearly and firmly. "I'm Special Agent Naomi Carter, Federal Bureau of Investigation. And you, Officer Stanton, are dangerously close to violating my rights." The crowd erupted into murmurs of astonishment, and Stanton's expression shifted from defiance to panic. He froze, his hand midway to his radio, unsure how to proceed. "You're FBI," he stammered, his voice barely audible. "Yes," Naomi replied, her tone firm. "And your behavior today has been completely unprofessional. Harassing innocent people based on your biases is not only inappropriate, but also a serious abuse of power." The crowd began to cheer and applaud as Naomi took a step closer to Stanton, her voice low but authoritative. "Your assumptions about me weren't just wrong. They were dangerous. What if I hadn't been in a position to defend myself? What if someone else without my resources had been subjected to this treatment?" Stanton swallowed hard, visibly shaken. Naomi didn't wait for him to respond. Instead, she turned to address the crowd, her voice carrying over the noise. "Thank you for recording this and bearing witness. Accountability starts with all of us. The applause grew louder as Naomi walked away, her heart heavy, but her resolve stronger. She knew this was far from over. The real work, ensuring justice and accountability, was just beginning. The weight of the badge. Naomi Carter drove back to the FBI field office in silence, the encounter with Officer Stanton replaying in her mind like an unyielding loop. Each word, each gesture, each assumption he made lingered like an unwelcome shadow. She had faced prejudice before, but today felt different. It was blatant, public, and utterly humiliating. Still, Naomi knew better than to let anger cloud her judgment. As an FBI agent, she had seen too many good intentions fizzle out because emotions overtook strategy. If she wanted real change, she had to be methodical. The familiar concrete and glass facade of the FBI field office loomed ahead. Naomi parked, grabbed her coffee, which was now lukewarm, and stepped inside. The air in the office buzzed with its usual energy, agents on phones, analysts glued to their computer screens, and teams huddled in strategy meetings. It was a stark contrast to the chaotic scene downtown. "Agent Carter," a voice called from across the room. She turned to see Special Agent in Charge, CAC, Kevin Blake, her immediate superior, approaching. His sharp suit and brisk walk screamed authority, but his expression carried concern. "I just got a call from downtown precinct," Blake began, his voice low but serious. "I understand you had an altercation with a patrol officer." Naomi nodded, unbothered by the slight edge in his tone. "Not an altercation, sir. An unnecessary and baseless interrogation." Blake motioned for her to follow him to his office. Once inside, he closed the door and gestured for her to sit. Naomi sat down, her back straight, her hands folded neatly on her lap. She could feel the weight of the conversation about to unfold. "Tell me what happened," Blake said, leaning against his desk. Naomi recounted the entire incident in detail, her voice calm and measured. She left nothing out. Stanton's tone, his assumptions, the crowd's reaction, and the way she revealed her badge only after he had escalated the situation. When she finished, Blake sighed, running a hand through his salt and pepper hair. "Naomi, you handled it well, but you understand this is going to cause waves, right?" "I'm counting on it," Naomi replied, her tone resolute. "This isn't just about me. It's about the fact that someone with less authority, someone without a badge, might have faced far worse. I can't let this slide." Blake studied her for a moment, his gaze unreadable. Then he nodded. "Write a formal report. I'll make sure it reaches the right people. But Naomi, be prepared. This might draw attention you're not ready for." Naomi met his gaze, unflinching. "I've been dealing with attention my entire career, sir. This time, it's going to be on my terms." Later that evening, Naomi sat in her apartment, laptop open, fingers poised over the keyboard. Her apartment was a reflection of her personality. Tidy, functional, but with touches of warmth. A throw blanket here, a framed family photo there. She had poured her life into her work, sacrificing personal relationships and social time to climb the ranks of the bureau. But tonight, her focus wasn't on her usual caseload. It was on Officer Greg Stanton and what he represented. She began typing her report, carefully detailing the events, her observations, and the broader implications of what had transpired. She included not just the facts, but also the context, the years of systemic bias she had witnessed, the countless stories of marginalized individuals who lacked the means to fight back. This wasn't just about one officer's mistake. It was about a system that allowed such mistakes to flourish unchecked. Halfway through her report, Naomi's phone buzzed. She glanced at the screen. An unknown number. Frowning, she answered. "Agent Carter." A woman's voice asked hesitantly. "Yes, this is she." "Who's calling?" "My name is Angela Rivers. I was downtown today. I recorded the whole thing with that officer." Her voice was shaky but determined. "I wanted to thank you for standing up to him. And if you need the footage, I'm more than happy to send it." Naomi's heart softened at the sincerity in Angela's voice. Thank you, Angela. That video could be instrumental in ensuring accountability. Can you email it to me? After exchanging details, Naomi hung up, feeling a spark of hope. The fact that bystanders were stepping forward showed that the tide was shifting. People were paying attention, and they were ready to act. The next morning, Naomi arrived at the field office to find a memo on her desk. It was from Sadie Blake, informing her that her report had been forwarded to both the FBI's Internal Review Board and the local precinct's Internal Affairs Division. The memo also mentioned that Officer Stanton had been placed on administrative leave pending investigation. As she read the memo, her phone buzzed again. This time, it was a text from Angela. The video has gone viral. People are talking about it everywhere. Naomi clicked the link Angela had included and was immediately directed to a social media post. The video of her encounter with Stanton had racked up thousands of views, and the comments section was a whirlwind of opinions. Some praised her for standing her ground. Others expressed outrage at Stanton's behavior. But what stood out to Naomi were the stories, people sharing their own experiences with law enforcement bias. One comment read, "This could have been me. Thank you, Agent Carter, for showing us that we deserve respect too." Another said, "This is exactly why we need reform. Officers like Stanton aren't the exception. They're the rule." Naomi scrolled through the comments, feeling a mix of emotions: anger at the stories of injustice, pride in the support she was receiving, and a deep sense of responsibility to keep pushing forward. Later that day, Naomi received a call from the mayor's office. The mayor, a progressive leader with a reputation for tackling tough issues, wanted to meet with her. "You've sparked an important conversation, Agent Carter," the mayor said when Naomi arrived at City Hall. "But conversations only go so far. I'd like to work with you to turn this moment into a movement." Naomi leaned forward, intrigued. "What do you have in mind?" "A task force," the mayor replied. "One that addresses systemic bias in law enforcement. And I want you to lead it." Naomi felt the weight of the mayor's words. It was a daunting proposition, but she knew it was the right path. "I'll do it," she said without hesitation. "But only if we're serious about real change, training, accountability, and community involvement." The mayor nodded. "That's exactly what I'm counting on." By the end of the day, Naomi felt a sense of purpose she hadn't experienced in years. The viral video, the public outcry, the mayor's initiative, it was all converging into something much larger than her initial encounter with Officer Stanton. She wasn't just fighting for herself. She was fighting for everyone who had ever been underestimated, mistreated, or dismissed because of the color of their skin or the weight of their circumstances. As she drove home, Naomi thought about the road ahead. It would be long and fraught with challenges, but she was ready. Her badge wasn't just a symbol of her authority. It was a symbol of her commitment to justice. And justice, she knew, didn't come without a fight. Building bridges, breaking barriers. The sun was setting over the city as Naomi Carter prepared for her first meeting with the newly formed task force. The room she entered wasn't particularly large, but its significance loomed larger than any office or conference hall she had ever been in. Seated around the table were representatives from every facet of the city's social fabric: law enforcement officers, community leaders, civil rights activists, educators, and even a few local business owners. Each of them had been handpicked by the mayor for their dedication to justice and reform. Naomi paused at the doorway for a moment, observing the individuals who had been gathered here. The tension in the air was palpable. These were people from different walks of life, many with vastly opposing viewpoints. Their faces told stories of hope, skepticism, and, in some cases, outright distrust. Naomi took a deep breath and stepped forward, determined to unify them under a common cause. "Good evening," she began, her voice steady and commanding enough to cut through the chatter. All eyes turned to her. "My name is Special Agent Naomi Carter, and I've been asked to lead this task force. But let me make one thing clear. I'm not here to dictate. I'm here to listen, to collaborate, and to find solutions. If we're going to make meaningful changes, we need to do it together. She let her words hang in the air for a moment, gauging the room's response. Some nodded, while others remained skeptical. Naomi knew trust wasn't something that could be built in one meeting, but she was ready to do the work. The first agenda item was straightforward: defining the task force's goals. Naomi posed a question to the group. What does success look like to you? The room was silent at first, but eventually, a community leader named Marcus spoke up. Marcus was a tall, imposing man in his 50s, with a booming voice that commanded attention. Success, he said, looks like my son being able to walk home from school without worrying about being stopped by the police because of the color of his skin. Naomi nodded, acknowledging the weight of his words. That's a powerful and important goal. But how do we get there? Rebecca Lopez, one of the few officers in the room, hesitated before speaking. We need better training. Too many officers rely on their instincts, but those instincts are shaped by biases they don't even realize they have. Training is part of it, said Tasha, a young civil rights activist who had been vocal on social media about the need for police accountability. But training doesn't mean anything if there aren't consequences for bad behavior. We need accountability. Naomi's pen moved swiftly as she took notes. The discussion grew more animated as others chimed in, debating the merits of different approaches. Some argued for increased community policing, while others stressed the importance of body cameras and independent oversight committees. One business owner, a middle-aged woman named Claire, shared her perspective. My employees are scared to drive through certain neighborhoods because they've been pulled over for no reason too many times. This isn't just a moral issue. It's bad for business, too. Naomi let the conversation flow, her role shifting from leader to facilitator. She encouraged the quieter voices in the room to speak, ensuring that everyone had a chance to contribute. As the meeting progressed, she noticed the group's dynamic beginning to shift. The skepticism in the room was slowly being replaced by a sense of purpose. After hours of discussion, the task force agreed on a preliminary list of objectives. Mandatory implicit bias training, not just for law enforcement, but for city officials and community leaders as well. Community liaison programs, pairing officers with local residents to foster mutual understanding and trust. Accountability measures, a clear system for investigating complaints against officers, with consequences for misconduct. Youth engagement initiatives, creating mentorship programs and safe spaces for dialogue between young people and law enforcement. Naomi concluded the meeting with a challenge. These are excellent starting points, but ideas alone won't create change. Each of us needs to commit to action. I'll be reaching out to every one of you individually to discuss how we can turn these goals into reality. As the task force members filed out, Naomi noticed Agent Lopes lingering by the door. The officer approached her hesitantly. Agent Carter, Lopes began, her voice uncharacteristically soft. I want to thank you for how you handled today. A lot of us in law enforcement feel like we're always on the defensive, but you made it clear that this isn't about blame. It's about solutions. I appreciate that. Naomi smiled, her posture relaxing slightly. Thank you, Sergeant. I know these conversations aren't easy, but they're necessary. And I'm glad you're here. The following weeks were a whirlwind of activity. Naomi's days were split between her regular FBI duties and her work with the task force. She found herself in meetings with city officials, hosting workshops, and even visiting local schools to speak with students about the importance of justice and accountability. She was determined to ensure that the task force's initiatives didn't remain theoretical. They had to be implemented. One of the most impactful moments came during a youth engagement event. Naomi had invited Marcus's son, Jamal, a bright but guarded teenager, to participate. The event paired young people with officers in a series of trust-building exercises. Jamal had been reluctant to attend, but after some coaxing from his father, he agreed. Naomi watched as he was paired with Officer Daniels, a young recruit with an open mind but limited experience. The two were tasked with building a model bridge using only toothpicks and glue. At first, they worked in near silence, the tension between them palpable. But as the exercise progressed, Naomi noticed them starting to talk. By the end of the activity, they were laughing and sharing stories. When the event ended, Jamal approached Naomi. "Agent Carter," he said, his voice tinged with both surprise and gratitude. "I didn't think I'd ever trust a cop, but Daniels was cool. I think this program could actually work." Naomi placed a hand on his shoulder. "I'm proud of you, Jamal. Trust takes time, but you took the first step today." As the task force's initiatives gained traction, Naomi began to see tangible results. Complaints about police misconduct decreased, community events saw record attendance, and social media buzzed with stories of positive interactions between officers and residents. But not everyone was on board. Officer Stanton, who had been placed on administrative leave after the initial incident, remained a contentious figure. While some in the department supported the reforms, others saw them as a threat to their authority. Stanton, in particular, had become a vocal critic, claiming he had been unfairly targeted. Naomi knew Stanton's resistance was a symptom of a larger problem. Reform wasn't just about changing policies, it was about changing mindsets, and that was the hardest battle of all. One evening, Naomi received an email from a community member. The subject line read, "Thank you." Inside was a heartfelt message from a woman who had witnessed Naomi's encounter with Stanton. "You didn't just stand up for yourself," the email read. "You stood up for all of us who have ever felt invisible, powerless, or judged. Thank you for showing us what courage looks like." Naomi closed her laptop, her eyes misty. She knew the road ahead would be long and fraught with challenges, but messages like this reminded her why she had chosen to fight. This wasn't just about reforming a system, it was about transforming a city, and Naomi was determined to see it through. Resistance and resilience. Naomi Carter sat at her desk in the dimly lit FBI office, reviewing a thick folder of documents. The task force's initiatives were gaining momentum, but with progress came resistance. She could feel the tension mounting, not just from certain factions within the police department, but also from a vocal minority in the community who viewed the reforms as disruptive or unnecessary. Change was always uncomfortable, and Naomi knew that discomfort often bred backlash. The email she had received earlier that day replayed in her mind. It wasn't a message of gratitude or support, but a stark warning from someone anonymous, laden with veiled threats. "You're stirring up trouble, Agent Carter. Don't think everyone is on your side." Naomi closed her eyes, inhaling deeply to steady her nerves. This wasn't the first time she'd faced hostility, but it was a reminder of the stakes. For every step forward, there were forces trying to pull her 2 steps back. But Naomi was no stranger to adversity. She built her career on confronting the impossible, and this would be no different. The next morning, Naomi met with the task force at a community center on the city's south side. The building was buzzing with activity as children played in the hallways and parents attended workshops. The vibrant energy was a stark contrast to the serious topics the task force was set to address. As the meeting began, Marcus, the community leader, wasted no time voicing his concerns. "We've seen progress, sure, but the resistance is growing louder. People are calling the reforms a waste of resources, and some officers are outright refusing to participate." Naomi nodded, her expression thoughtful. "I've heard the complaints. Resistance is part of the process, but it's not an excuse to stop. We anticipated this, and we need to stay the course." Tasha, the young activist, leaned forward, her frustration evident. "But what about the officers who are undermining the reforms? How do we handle them?" "Sheet." Rebecca Lopes cleared her throat. "It's not as simple as you think. Change doesn't happen overnight, especially in an institution as entrenched as law enforcement. Some of my colleagues are set in their ways, but others are just scared of losing control, scared of making mistakes. It's fear disguised as defiance." Naomi tapped her pen against the table, her mind racing. "Then we address the fear. Transparency is key. If officers see that these reforms aren't designed to punish them, but to build trust and improve their relationships with the community, some of that fear will dissipate. Marcus raised an eyebrow. And what about the ones who refuse to change, no matter what? People like Stanton. The room fell silent. Stanton had become a symbol of the resistance, a cautionary tale for some, a martyr for others. He had continued to stir controversy, giving interviews to local media outlets where he painted himself as the victim of a witch hunt. "We hold them accountable," Naomi said firmly. "No one is above accountability. Not officers, not community leaders, not even me. If Stanton wants to fight reform, he's welcome to. But we'll meet his resistance with facts, transparency, and the will of the people who want change." As the meeting adjourned, Naomi stayed behind to speak with Street Lopes. The sergeant had been instrumental in bridging the gap between the task force and the police department, but Naomi could sense her frustration. "Rebecca," Naomi began, "I know this hasn't been easy for you. You've been the face of reform within your department, and I imagine that's come with its own challenges." Lopes sighed, rubbing her temples. "You have no idea. Some of the older officers look at me like I've betrayed them. And Stanton, he's rallying them against me." Naomi placed a reassuring hand on Lopez's shoulder. "You're doing the right thing. Change always comes with resistance, but you've been brave enough to stand for what's right. That matters." Lopes managed a small smile. "Thanks, Naomi. But bravery doesn't make the job any easier." Naomi nodded. "No, it doesn't. But it's what separates us from those who cling to the status quo." The resistance wasn't limited to grumbling officers and anonymous emails. A week later, Naomi received a call from the mayor's office. Protesters had gathered outside City Hall, holding signs that read, "Defend our police," and "Stop targeting heroes." The mayor, a pragmatic leader, sounded concerned. "Agent Carter, this protest isn't just noise. Stanton's allies are organized, and they're trying to paint the reforms as anti-police. We need to address this before it spirals." Naomi understood the delicate balance required. "I'll handle it," she assured the mayor. "We need to frame this not as anti-police but as pro-community." That evening, Naomi appeared at a press conference alongside the mayor and Chief Lopes. The event was held in front of a local community center, with reporters and cameras capturing every word. Naomi stepped up to the podium, her voice steady and clear. "Let me be absolutely clear. These reforms are not about attacking law enforcement. They are about building trust, creating safer neighborhoods, and ensuring that every citizen, regardless of their background, feels respected and valued. Accountability isn't an attack. It's a commitment to excellence. And excellence is what we should all strive for." Her words struck a chord. The media coverage of the press conference painted the reforms in a positive light, emphasizing the collaborative efforts of the task force. But Naomi knew this was only one battle in a much larger war. Back at the FBI office, Naomi received an unexpected visitor, Officer Stanton. He walked in without warning, his face a mask of determination and simmering anger. "Agent Carter," he began, his voice tight, "I want to talk." Naomi gestured for him to sit. "Go ahead." Stanton sat across from her, his jaw clenched. "I've been painted as the bad guy in all of this, but I was just doing my job." Naomi leaned forward, her eyes locking onto his. "Your job, Officer Stanton, is to serve and protect. What you did wasn't serving or protecting. It was profiling and harassing. And that's the problem." Stanton opened his mouth to protest, but Naomi raised a hand to stop him. "Listen, Greg, I don't think you're a bad person, but you made a bad decision, a dangerous one. And instead of taking responsibility, you've chosen to double down. That's not leadership, that's fear." Her words hung in the air, heavy and unyielding. Stanton looked away, his bravado faltering. "So what do you want from me?" he finally asked. "I want you to learn," Naomi said simply. "Attend the bias training. Talk to the community. Stop seeing accountability as an attack and start seeing it as an opportunity to grow. Stanton stood, his expression unreadable. "I'll think about it," he muttered before walking out. Naomi watched him go, unsure if her words had reached him. But she knew one thing for certain. Change wasn't about convincing everyone. It was about creating momentum that couldn't be stopped. As the weeks turned into months, the reforms began to take root. Community events became more frequent, officers participated in dialogue sessions with residents, and youth programs flourished. Naomi's work was far from over, but she could see the beginnings of a brighter future. One evening, as she prepared to leave the office, her phone buzzed with a message. It was from Stitch. "Lopes. You won't believe this, but Stanton just signed up for the next training session." Naomi smiled, a flicker of hope warming her heart. Change was slow, messy, and unpredictable, but it was happening. And Naomi Carter wasn't going anywhere. A storm brews. The crackle of thunder echoed through the city as rain splattered against Naomi Carter's apartment window. It was the kind of night that invited reflection, but Naomi had no time for that. Her dining table was cluttered with reports, community feedback forms, and case files. She leaned forward, her elbows on the table and her hands cradling her head. The weight of her dual responsibilities, an FBI agent by day and the leader of a citywide reform initiative by night, was starting to wear her down. Her phone buzzed, pulling her from her thoughts. The caller ID flashed Mayor's office. Naomi exhaled sharply before answering. "Agent Carter." The mayor's assistant began, her tone strained. "We have a situation." Naomi's stomach tightened. "What kind of situation?" "There's been an incident at one of the community liaison events," the assistant explained. "It's bad. Protesters showed up, and things got out of hand. There are reports of vandalism, and an officer was injured." Naomi felt a surge of frustration. The task force's initiatives were making tangible progress, but every step forward seemed to provoke a backlash. "I'll be there in 20 minutes, she said, grabbing her jacket and keys. The scene at the community center was chaotic. Police cars lined the street, their red and blue lights reflecting off puddles on the pavement. A small crowd of protesters had gathered on one side, shouting slogans and holding signs that read "Defund the task force" and "End the witch hunt." On the other side, community members and volunteers stood silently, their expressions a mix of anger and exhaustion. Naomi spotted Rebecca Lopes near the entrance, speaking with a fellow officer. Lopez's face was tense, her usually composed demeanor frayed. "What happened?" Naomi asked as she approached. Lopes sighed heavily. "The protesters showed up about an hour ago. They were shouting at the officers participating in the liaison event, accusing them of being traitors. Things escalated when someone threw a bottle. One of our officers was hit and had to be taken to the hospital. No major injuries, but it's bad PR." Naomi's jaw tightened. "And the protesters?" "Most of them left when the police arrived, but a few stuck around. No arrests were made, yet." Naomi glanced at the remaining protesters. They were a small but vocal group, their chants echoing through the night. "We need to address this before it spirals further." The next day, Naomi convened an emergency meeting with the task force. The tension in the room was palpable. Marcus, the community leader, was visibly agitated. "This is exactly what I was afraid of," he said, his voice rising. "The more we push for reform, the more resistance we face. How are we supposed to make progress when people are determined to tear it all down?" Tasha, the young activist, folded her arms. "We can't let them win. The protesters don't represent the majority. They're just the loudest. We need to drown them out with our own message." Lopes spoke next, her tone measured but firm. "We also need to ensure the safety of everyone involved in these events, officers and community members alike. Last night was a wake-up call." Naomi listened intently, her pen moving across her notebook as she jotted down key points. When the discussion quieted, she stood, her gaze sweeping the room. "Last night was a setback, but it's not the end. We knew this wouldn't be easy. Change never is, but we can't afford to lose sight of why we're here. For every protester shouting against us, there are 10 people who believe in what we're doing. Let's focus on them." The room nodded in agreement, though the tension lingered. Naomi outlined a plan. Increase security at liaison events, create a public statement addressing the incident, and organize a community forum to foster dialogue between supporters and skeptics. Later that week, Naomi found herself back at City Hall, standing behind a podium in a packed press room. Cameras clicked and reporters murmured as she adjusted the microphone. "Good afternoon," she began, her voice steady and clear. "Last week's incident at the community liaison event was a reminder of the challenges we face as we work toward reform. But let me be clear, we will not be deterred. These initiatives are about creating a safer, fairer community for everyone. To those who oppose us, I say this: our goal is not division but unity. And to those who support us, I say thank you. Your voices are what keep us moving forward." Her words were met with a mix of applause and skepticism, but Naomi had expected that. She knew winning over the public wouldn't happen overnight. As the task force's initiatives continued, Naomi decided to focus on bridging the gap between law enforcement and the community. One of the most ambitious programs involved a series of town hall meetings where officers and residents could share their perspectives in a moderated setting. The first meeting was held in a high school gymnasium. The room was packed, with standing room only. Naomi stood at the front, flanked by Ischit, Lopes, and Marcus. A panel of officers and community members sat behind them, ready to field questions. Naomi began the evening with a simple statement: "We're here to listen. This is your space to share your experiences, your concerns, and your ideas. Let's build something better, together." The first few speakers were hesitant, their words tinged with fear and frustration. A young mother recounted how her son had been unfairly stopped by police. An older man shared his disillusionment with the justice system. Each story added weight to the room, but Naomi noticed something else. The officers on the panel were listening. Truly listening. When it was time for the officers to speak, Lopes took the microphone. "I've been a police officer for 15 years, and I'll be the first to admit we've made mistakes. But I'm here because I believe we can do better. And I'm asking for your help in making that happen." The audience responded with cautious applause. It was a small victory, but Naomi knew it was significant. Not everyone was on board. At the end of the meeting, Naomi was approached by a man who had been sitting in the back row, his arms crossed tightly. He was older, with a weathered face and a sharp gaze. "Agent Carter," he said, his tone clipped, "I appreciate what you're trying to do, but you're dreaming if you think this city will ever change. People don't trust the police, and for good reason. This isn't going to fix that." Naomi met his gaze, her expression calm but resolute. "You're right. Trust isn't built overnight, but every conversation, every program, every small step we take brings us closer. I won't stop trying, and I hope you won't either." The man nodded reluctantly, a flicker of respect in his eyes. "Good luck. You'll need it." As Naomi drove home that night, she felt a mix of exhaustion and determination. The challenges were mounting, but so were the victories, small, incremental, but real. For every voice of dissent, there was a voice of hope. And for Naomi, that was enough to keep fighting. The storm wasn't over, but Naomi Carter had learned how to weather it. The turning point. Naomi Carter stood on the edge of the rooftop garden of the city's community center, the cityscape stretching before her. The evening breeze carried with it the scent of impending rain. She was waiting for the last of the day's meetings to conclude, a discussion with a local coalition about expanding youth engagement programs. The work had been grueling, the resistance fierce, but tonight carried the weight of something she hadn't felt in a while. Hope. Her phone buzzed in her jacket pocket, breaking her reverie. She glanced at the screen. It was a message from Marcus. "Emergency meeting. Protesters planning to disrupt tomorrow's summit. Meet at City Hall ASAP. Naomi clenched her jaw, her moment of peace evaporating. The summit was the task force's most ambitious initiative yet, a gathering of law enforcement, community leaders, and policymakers from across the state to showcase their progress and push for statewide reform. If it were derailed, it could set their efforts back months. Naomi grabbed her things and headed to City Hall, her mind racing. By the time she arrived, the task force members were already gathered in the mayor's conference room. The mood was tense. Marcus stood at the head of the table, a tablet in his hands displaying a stream of social media posts. The protesters were mobilizing quickly, their rhetoric more aggressive than ever. "They're saying we're destroying the police," Marcus explained. "That we're dismantling public safety. They're planning to swarm the summit, disrupt the panels, and make it impossible for us to present." "Seat," Rebecca Lopes frowned. "If they turn up in numbers, we'll need significant security. But too much police presence could escalate the situation." Naomi crossed her arms, her mind working through the possibilities. "What about engaging them before the summit?" she asked. "Invite some of their leaders to meet with us, hear their concerns." Tasha, the young activist, shook her head. "These aren't people looking for dialogue, Naomi. They're trying to shut us down, not talk." Naomi exhaled deeply, the weight of the situation pressing down on her. "Then we'll prepare for both scenarios. Marcus, reach out to anyone in their ranks who might be open to conversation. Rebecca, work with the police department to ensure a measured security response. And let's double down on our message. Make sure the public knows exactly what we're fighting for." The room buzzed with activity as the team set to work. Naomi remained at the table, her thoughts focused on the summit and what it represented. This wasn't just a meeting. It was a statement, a demonstration of how far they'd come and how much further they were willing to go. The next morning, the summit began under heavy skies. A line of reporters and attendees stretched outside the venue, their chatter blending with the low hum of police radios. Inside, the task force had transformed the space into a showcase of their work, displays of the mentorship programs, videos of successful community police dialogues, and panels featuring speakers from all walks of life. Naomi stood backstage, reviewing her opening remarks. Her heart pounded with the anticipation of the day ahead. She glanced at her watch, -10 minutes until showtime. The protesters hadn't yet arrived, but the tension in the air was palpable. "Agent Carter," Marcus said, approaching her with urgency. "We've got a problem." Naomi followed him to a side entrance, where a small group of officers was monitoring a live feed from outside the building. The protesters had begun to gather, dozens of them at first, but the numbers were growing quickly. They carried signs that read, "Stop the agenda," and "Save our police." Some were chanting, their voices growing louder by the minute. "Do we engage?" one of the officers asked, his hand hovering near his radio. Naomi shook her head. "Not yet. Let's give them space, but keep an eye on the crowd. No one moves unless there's a clear threat." She turned to Rebecca, who had just joined them. "I need you out there. Talk to your team. Make sure no one overreacts. We can't afford a confrontation." Rebecca nodded and headed outside, her face a mask of determination. Naomi returned to the stage, determined to stay focused. The summit had to go on. The opening session was a success. Naomi's speech set the tone, highlighting the task force's accomplishments and their vision for the future. Panelists shared stories of lives changed by the reforms, from a young man who had found mentorship through the youth program to an officer who had forged genuine connections with his community. But as the morning progressed, the protesters grew louder. Their chants could be heard faintly inside the venue, a constant reminder of the fragile balance Naomi was trying to maintain. During a break between sessions, Naomi stepped outside to assess the situation. The crowd of protesters had swelled, spilling into the street. Rebecca was speaking with a group of officers, her body language calm but firm. Naomi approached her. "How bad is it?" she asked. "They're staying back for now, but tensions are high," Rebecca replied. "We've had a few heated exchanges, but nothing physical." Naomi nodded, scanning the crowd. Amid the sea of signs and faces, she spotted a man who looked vaguely familiar. He was tall, with a commanding presence and an air of authority. As she watched, he stepped forward and addressed the crowd through a megaphone. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice carrying over the noise, "this summit is a charade. They say it's about reform, but it's really about control. We need to stand our ground and show them we won't be silenced." Naomi's stomach sank as recognition clicked into place. It was Officer Stanton. Back inside, Naomi called an emergency meeting with the task force. "Stanton's leading the protesters," she announced, her voice tight. "This changes things." Marcus slammed a hand on the table. "That man has been a thorn in our side from day one. If he's out there, he's not just protesting, he's rallying them." "We need to de-escalate," Tasha said. "If Stanton pushes them too far, this could turn into a full-blown riot." Naomi's mind raced. Stanton's presence was a calculated move, one designed to undermine everything the summit stood for. But she also knew that confronting him directly could backfire. "I'll go," she said finally. "I'll speak to him." The room erupted in protest, but Naomi held up a hand. "This isn't about him. It's about the crowd. If I can get him to back down, we can avoid a disaster." Naomi stepped outside into the thick of the protest, her heart pounding. She approached Stanton, who was still addressing the crowd. When he saw her, his expression shifted to one of smug defiance. "Agent Carter," he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Come to join the people." Naomi stood her ground, her gaze steady. "Officer Stanton, I'm here to talk. Let's step aside." Stanton hesitated, but the presence of cameras and onlookers seemed to compel him. He followed her to a quieter spot, away from the crowd. "What do you want?" he asked, crossing his arms. "To stop this from escalating," Naomi replied. "You're angry. I get it. But this isn't the way to make your point." "My point," Stanton snapped, "is that you're tearing apart the department I've served for 20 years. "No," Naomi countered, her voice calm but firm. "I'm building something better. And deep down, you know that. You've seen the changes. We're making progress. Don't let your pride get in the way of something bigger than either of us." Stanton's jaw tightened, his gaze flickering with uncertainty. For a moment, Naomi thought she'd reached him. But then he shook his head. "This isn't over," he muttered, turning back to the crowd. Naomi returned inside, her heart heavy. The summit continued without incident, but the encounter with Stanton lingered in her mind. He was a symbol of the resistance they faced, a reminder that the fight for reform was far from over. But as the day drew to a close, Naomi felt a flicker of hope. The summit had been a success, despite the protests. Attendees left inspired, ready to carry the task force's vision to their own communities. As Naomi stood on the stage for the closing remarks, she looked out at the audience, a mix of law enforcement, community leaders, and everyday citizens. They were proof that change was possible, even in the face of opposition. "This isn't the end," she said, her voice steady. "It's the beginning. Together, we can build a future where trust and justice prevail. Thank you for being part of this journey." The room erupted in applause, and for the first time in weeks, Naomi felt a sense of peace. The road ahead was long, but she was ready to walk it. The moment of reckoning. As Naomi descended the stage, the applause still echoing in the hall, she allowed herself a brief moment of pride. The summit had been a success in many ways. Panels had inspired meaningful conversations, and the task force's accomplishments were on full display. Yet the shadow of Stanton's protest lingered in her mind. He hadn't just been a critic. He'd become a lightning rod for those who opposed reform, and his presence outside wasn't going away anytime soon. Rebecca Lopes caught up with Naomi as she made her way toward the conference room, where the task force was wrapping up its final discussions. "You handled that beautifully," Lopes said, her voice carrying a hint of relief. "The crowd inside is on our side. But I need to tell you something." Naomi paused, turning to face her. "What is it?" "Stanton left," Lopes said, her expression unreadable. "After your talk with him, he disappeared from the protest. No one knows where he went." Naomi's brow furrowed. "Do you think he's planning something?" Lopes hesitated before responding. "I don't know, but I've worked with Stanton long enough to know he doesn't just walk away. He's stubborn, and if he feels like he's losing, he'll find another way to fight." The final meeting of the day took place in a quieter wing of the venue. Members of the task force gathered to review the successes of the summit and chart the next steps. Marcus was jubilant, his energy infectious as he talked about the momentum they'd gained. Tasha was equally enthusiastic, brainstorming ideas for expanding their programs to other cities. Even Rebecca seemed cautiously optimistic. Naomi listened, contributing where necessary, but her mind kept drifting back to Stanton. His words during their brief exchange gnawed at her. "This isn't over." As the meeting concluded, Naomi stayed behind, the room now empty save for her and the quiet hum of the projector cooling down. She opened her phone and scrolled through the news feeds covering the summit. Most of the headlines were positive, but one article caught her eye. "Protests against reform spark debate about policing future." The article featured an interview with Stanton. In it, he criticized the task force, accusing them of dismantling the department's authority and creating distrust between officers and the public. His words were biting, but what stood out to Naomi was the closing line. "Sometimes, to save a ship, you have to throw out the captain." Naomi set her phone down, her pulse quickening. She could feel it. Stanton wasn't just resisting. He was organizing, plotting something larger. 2 weeks later, Naomi's suspicions were confirmed. A whistleblower within the police department, an officer who had quietly supported the task force, approached her with critical information. Stanton had been holding clandestine meetings with a small group of officers and vocal reform opponents. They were planning a campaign to undermine the task force, starting with her. "He's been saying you're unfit to lead," the whistleblower explained, his voice low and urgent. "He's spreading rumors, twisting the narrative to make it look like you're using the task force to settle personal scores." Naomi clenched her fists but kept her composure. "Why now? Why escalate?" The officer hesitated. "Because you're winning. The summit was a turning point, and he knows it. He's desperate." Naomi thanked the officer for coming forward and immediately called an emergency meeting with the mayor and key members of the task force. The meeting was tense. Marcus, Tasha, Rebecca, and the mayor sat around the table as Naomi outlined what she'd learned. The mayor frowned deeply, leaning back in his chair. "This isn't just resistance," he said. "This is sabotage." Marcus slammed his fist on the table. "We can't let him win. If he turns this into a battle of public opinion, we'll lose everything we've built." Naomi nodded. "We need to act, but we can't stoop to his level. Transparency is our greatest weapon. If he wants to fight this in the public arena, we'll meet him there, with facts and results." The mayor agreed. "We'll hold a press conference, lay everything out. The task force's goals, the progress we've made, and the challenges we're facing, and we'll address Stanton's accusations head-on." The press conference was held the following week in front of City Hall. Naomi stood at the podium, flanked by the mayor, Rebecca, and Marcus. A sea of reporters and cameras focused on her as she began. "In recent days, there have been efforts to discredit the work of this task force and the reforms we fought so hard to implement. Let me be clear. These reforms are not about division. They're about building trust, accountability, and safety for everyone in this city. We will not be deterred by fear-mongering or personal attacks." Naomi paused, letting her words sink in before continuing. "To those who oppose us, I invite you to the table. Let's talk. Let's find common ground. But let me warn you, if your goal is to derail progress, you will not succeed." Her words were met with applause, and as she stepped away from the podium, She felt a surge of resolve. The fight wasn't over, but she was ready for it. The final chapter of Stanton's resistance came a month later. An internal investigation, prompted by Naomi's whistleblower, revealed that Stanton had violated multiple department policies, including misuse of resources and intimidation of colleagues. He was stripped of his badge and forced to resign. His departure sent a clear message. Resistance to accountability would not be tolerated. For Naomi, the victory was bittersweet. Stanton's downfall wasn't a celebration. It was a reminder of the deep-rooted challenges that still needed to be addressed. But it was also proof that change was possible. Months later, Naomi stood in the same community center where the task force had first met. The room was filled with familiar faces: Marcus, Tasha, Rebecca, and countless others who had joined the movement along the way. They were there to celebrate the task force's accomplishments: a drop in complaints against officers, increased community engagement, and statewide recognition of their programs. As Naomi addressed the crowd, her voice carried the weight of everything they'd endured together. "This journey has not been easy," she said. "We've faced resistance, criticism, and doubt. But we've also seen the power of hope, collaboration, and resilience. This isn't the end, it's a beginning. And together, we will continue to build a future where justice and trust prevail." The crowd erupted in applause, and for the first time in months, Naomi allowed herself to feel a sense of closure. The work would never truly be done, but they had taken a giant step forward. As the celebration continued, Naomi stepped outside for a moment of quiet. The city skyline stretched before her, illuminated by the soft glow of the evening lights. She thought of all the people who had been part of this journey, those who had fought beside her, those who had doubted her, and even those who had opposed her. She had faced adversity, weathered storms, and stood her ground. And in doing so, she had proven that change wasn't just possible, it was inevitable. Naomi Carter turned back toward the celebration, ready to continue the fight for a better tomorrow. For her, the journey was far from over, but the victories they had achieved gave her hope for the battles yet to come.